Anthony Cifarelli is the grandfather of Gianni Chandler. Looking through possible candidates to interview, we chose Tony because he could have been drafted at the time. Because of his age at the time, he had a very good memory of what happened during the war and his opinions of these events. Although he was not fighting in the war, he worked very closely with the war because he worked for a defense company. He worked in an aerospace and in air as a human factors psychologist.
Well, life was very good because the World War II was over in the 1940s, and there was some wars going on into Korea during the 1950s. But life was pretty casual in the small town that I grew up with in the 1950s. So those are my primary experiences of nothing serious happening in the 50s. It was kind of a fun area with rock and roll and good economic conditions and so on. And it was about the time that I graduated high school that I became aware of the Vietnam War, because it was that period of time when some of my friends were going into the service and the war was increasing.
In 1949, China became a communist country. Following this, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam as an independent country. After this, Ho Chi Minh's army and the French began to fight in a war. The war ended after the French lost the battle at Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam was divided as a result of this. The northern half was under control of the communists, and the southern part still supported the French. After the South lost supporters in strength, communists in the north took advantage of this by rebelling against the South. North Vietnam called themselves the Viet Cong and were armed and trained by the North. At the time, the United States had made a promise to help any nation who could have been threatened by communism. They believed that communism was going to take over, and they were not going to let that happen. John F. Kennedy saw Vietnam as a nation who had been threatened and reacted to this by sending military advisors to South Vietnam. After a U.S. warship had been attacked, Lyndon Johnson, who was Kennedy's successor, began to send troops to South Vietnam.
A lot of Americans thought that the war was necessary to forestall or prevent communist expansion. Remember, at this period of our history, we had just finished the Second World War, the Korean War, and there were a lot of horrible things going on in the world. And the communist governments were considered to be evil forces in the world that were bent on dominating the world. They had very few freedoms. They were certainly not very good on human rights. And so I think America felt at that time that they were doing the right thing to prevent the communists from dominating the world affairs.
During the Vietnam War, the number of people resisting the draft reached an all-time high. The possibility of being drafted caused many people to feel personally affected by the war. People would not report when inductions were called or would claim that they had a disability when they did not. Some even fled through Underground Railroad networks through Canada. Through the 1960s, many college campuses became places to protest the war. Many people did not believe in the draft because they did not want to have to fight for a cause they didn't believe in. In 1964, students began to burn their draft cards to prove a point. Many college students wrote letters to the White House to say how they did not believe in the draft. In the 1970s, the resistance to the draft reached its peak. There were far too many people to arrest, so the government couldn't do much about the resistance. In 1977, President Carter allowed people to return to the United States who had fled abroad to resist the draft. There were more than 200,000 people accused of offending the draft, and less than 9,000 were actually convicted.
And at that time, I had a college deferment because I was going to school. And this was one of the controversies of the Vietnam War, and that is, it was really an unfair situation in that the kids that were lower middle class kids that were not going to college were disproportionately brought into the service through the draft. I was lucky I was in college, so I had a college deferment. And then after I left college to go to work, I had a defense deferment. That is, I worked for a defense company. I was in aerospace and defense work as a human factors psychologist. and working on training naval aviators and studying naval aviation training. I think that at this particular time, sort of everyone thought there should be some obligation to the military, because this was a period of time when the world was encompassed by conflict and everyone sort of had an idea that they had a duty to bear. So I would have been okay going into the service, although I don't think I...
On March 16, 1968, a platoon of United States soldiers killed somewhere between 200 and 500 innocent civilians, anyone from babies to elderly men. This was known as the infamous My Lai Massacre. The soldiers were ordered to destroy the village. They were ordered that anyone found in My Lai were either Viet Cong or Viet Cong sympathizers. But the army did not only destroy the village, but did so with extreme brutality. Soldiers raped and tortured innocent villagers before killing them. They dragged many people, including children and babies, into ditches where they killed them with automatic weapons. The massacre ended with a warrant officer, Hugh Thompson, landing his army helicopter pilot between the soldiers and the villagers, who threatened to open fire if they continued attacking. They attempted to cover up these attacks until a soldier, Ron Ridenhour, who was not directly involved in the massacre, wrote about it to President Richard Nixon, the Department of Defense, the State Department, and various congressmen. His letter was put to the side until a journalist, Seymour Hersh, broke the story through an interview with an officer named Calley. Then My Lai was front-page news and became public knowledge. 14 officers were charged. However, only Calley was convicted of killing 22 people and was sentenced to life in prison. However, his time later was reduced to 20 years and then only to 10 years.
Well, I think, yes, I think this, the atrocity at My Lai, where an army lieutenant ordered his troops to kill everyone in the city, in the village rather. And he did so, and the troops did so. And that was portrayed on television, and it was horrific. And I don't think there's a human being in the world that would have not been affected by that. And that certainly was the final turning point for me in turning against the war, was the idea that American troops could commit such an atrocity. We were used to the atrocities of Nazi Germany. We were used to the atrocities in Korea, but all of the atrocities at least appeared to be on the other side, on the enemy side, if you will. Here, we were clearly in the wrong. And then that kind of triggered the look at what we were doing in these villages. We were burning villages down. We were bombing them with fire bombs. We were killing a lot of innocent people. It was just horrific. And that was the change in the tide of the American public opinion, and certainly mine as well.
The last military unit left Vietnam on March 29, 1973. The United States still aided Saigon in their war. However, the United States' influence was no longer relevant. This was at the time of the Watergate scandal, which allowed Nixon's standing to dissolve. Finally, Congress decided to move out of Vietnam by passing a measure in the summer of 1973 that prohibited any U.S. military involvement in Vietnam.
I think just about every knowledgeable, educated, and informed American citizen, by the time 1968 rolled around, was opposed to the war. The caution, at least, not to get involved in a country where there was an ongoing conflict between two factions that wanted different forms of government. I think we did learn that. I think we did learn to limit the kinds of weapons we used. For example, I don't think we use napalm anymore. Napalm was a mixture of jellied gasoline bomb that they used to burn down villages. A lot of innocent people died, and that was a horrific weapon. Well, I think it's sort of like today in the sense that if you just watch the news every night, you could get pretty depressed because you see so much violence and so much injustice, and so it began to affect people's lives in that way.